The restroom was quiet. Too quiet. The sterile, harsh lights buzzed above, casting long, unforgiving shadows across the white tiles. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, the kind that stings your nostrils and makes your throat dry. The low hum of the building outside barely reached this corner, where time seemed to slow down, trapped between the slick floors and the cold, metallic walls. In the far corner of the restroom, a man in his late 60s worked with deliberate care, his weary hands gripping the mop with practiced ease. He had been cleaning this very same restroom for years, his presence as invisible as the worn-out gloves he wore. Every day he moved quietly, barely noticed by the people who rushed past him, heads down, busy with their own lives. His name was Mr. Henry Porter, a man who had seen more than his fair share of life's struggles, but always carried on with dignity. His skin, darkened by the years and the sun, had wrinkles etched deep, not just from age, but from decades of hard work. His back was bent, but his steps were steady. The sound of the door creaked open, and the heels of someone's expensive shoes clicked sharply against the floor. The restroom's silence was broken by the noise, and then the faint voice of a man who sounded irritated, frustrated by something at work. "Ugh, this place is a mess," the man muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He was tall, his suit crisp and sharp, as though he had just stepped out of a boardroom meeting. The faint scent of cologne followed him in, overpowering the disinfectant in the air. The man, easily in his early 30s, a manager by the look of him, strode to the sink and began adjusting his tie. He caught sight of his reflection in the mirror, the kind of man who might pause to admire himself for a moment before stepping back into the world. Mr. Porter didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had seen this type before, the type who passed through life with blinders on, never stopping to think about the people who work behind the scenes. He kept mopping, the soft swish of the mop against the floor, the only sound in the room. The manager, still fuming, sighed loudly. "You know," he said with a sneer, glancing toward Mr. Porter's hunched form, "I don't know how you do it. Cleaning up after people like me, it must be a tough job." The words hung in the air like a cold wind. Mr. Porter's hands froze mid-mop, but he didn't look up. His face remained neutral, the years of insults and unfairness wearing a heavy, familiar mask over his features. He said nothing, didn't even flinch, as if the words didn't matter anymore. Maybe they didn't, but they did. The manager, oblivious, continued his rant. "I mean, who wants to scrub toilets for a living? Probably better than being on the street, huh?" He chuckled to himself, shaking his head at his own joke, and then turned toward the door. Mr. Porter's heart sank a little. The kind of remark that stung, but that he had learned to ignore. People like this manager often thought they could say whatever they wanted. People like him didn't matter. But then, just as the manager's hand reached for the door handle, there was a sound, a creak, a slight shift in the air, a door. It was the door to the stall, the one right behind the manager. The janitor, his heart racing now, knew the truth. Someone had been listening the entire time. The manager, of course, had no idea. He was just about to walk out when something he hadn't anticipated, stopped him. Behind him, from the shadows of the stall, came a low, steady voice, calm, measured. "Do you really think that's what this is about?" The manager froze, his hand still on the door handle. He turned slowly, his eyes widening. For the first time, He realized he wasn't alone in the restroom after all. The janitor, now standing tall, his eyes meeting the manager's with an intensity that made the air feel thick, stepped forward. The mop was gone. His back wasn't bent anymore. His posture was straight, and his presence, for the first time, filled the room with undeniable force. The manager's jaw clenched. The words he had just spoken, mocking and cruel, now felt heavy in his mouth. He wasn't sure what to say, but the silence was unbearable. "Do you really think," Mr. Porter repeated, "that you know what my life is like?" The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was stunned, caught in a moment where his ignorance collided with the reality of someone else's life, a life that was far more complex than he had ever considered. This wasn't just about a janitor cleaning up after people. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about the fact that sometimes the people we least expect are the ones who can teach us the most about life. And just like that, in the most unlikely of places, a cold, sterile restroom, the power balance shifted. But the question remained. Would the manager learn? Would he face his own ignorance? Or would he continue on, blind to the deeper truth that now hung in the air between them? Before we dive deeper into this intense story, I want to hear from you. What do you think about moments like these, where people who seem worlds apart come face to face with uncomfortable truths? Have you ever witnessed an encounter where someone's actions, whether intentional or not, changed the course of a situation? Comment below with your thoughts and share any experiences you've had where someone's words or actions challenged your perspective. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking stories like this one. We share powerful, emotional tales that will make you think, reflect, and maybe even see the world a little differently. Now, let's get back to the story. What happens next might just change everything for both of these men. The morning sun filtered softly through the windows, casting warm beams of light across the bustling city street. It was an ordinary day, one that began just like any other. In the heart of a city full of noise and fast-paced movement, there was one place where things moved just a little slower: the corner diner. This wasn't some sleek modern cafe with exposed brick and industrial light fixtures. No, this was an old-fashioned diner, the kind you'd expect to find tucked away on a street corner in any town. Simple, but full of heart. The booths were a little faded, and the air always carried the familiar scent of sizzling bacon and brewed coffee. The waitresses wore uniforms that had seen better days, and the clinking of dishes mixed with the hum of quiet conversations. Every morning, like clockwork, Mr. Henry Porter, the diner's janitor, arrived before the sun had fully risen. He would walk in, his worn boots echoing softly against the wooden floorboards, and head straight for the back room where he kept his supplies. The quiet buzz of the restaurant in the early hours gave him a sense of calm, a rare moment in his otherwise tiring routine. Mr. Porter wasn't what you would call a man of many words, but there was something undeniably steady about him. His work ethic was unparalleled. For the past decade, he had been cleaning this very diner, sweeping the floors, scrubbing the bathrooms, taking care of the little things that most people didn't even notice. But that was exactly the way he liked it. He preferred to stay in the background, out of the spotlight. He wasn't looking for recognition or praise. He just wanted to do his job and keep his head down. Henry had been doing this kind of work for most of his life. Born and raised in a small town, he had moved to the city as a young man, with hopes of finding something better, something bigger. But life hadn't quite worked out that way. Despite his hard work, there were always roadblocks, always something standing in his way. His skin, darkened by decades spent working outdoors, had become a reminder of the challenges he had faced and the hurdles he had overcome. Every wrinkle, every scar, each time his body ached at the end of the day, he knew it was part of the story of his life. Still, he didn't complain. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and it allowed him to stay independent. There was dignity in it, he often reminded himself. And though he didn't have much, he had his pride. Outside, the city buzzed with life. People rushed by, their heads buried in their phones, cars honking as they navigated through the busy streets. The world seemed to be in a constant state of motion, but inside the diner, time moved a little slower. The same people came in every day. The elderly couple who sat in the corner booth, quietly sipping coffee and chatting softly. The young businesswoman who always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs scrambled and a side of toast, no butter. The college student who barely spoke, but always paid with a few crumpled bills. Henry had gotten to know them all in his own quiet way. He'd watched their routines, listened to their stories as they chatted with the waitstaff, and sometimes, if they were feeling particularly generous, they'd offer him a smile or a kind word. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The diners were his community, even if they didn't know his name. Henry didn't mind. He had spent so many years being overlooked and underestimated that it no longer bothered him. It was just part of life. People saw what they wanted to see, and that's how it had always been for him. Never quite fitting into the world's expectations, never quite measuring up to the people who passed by with their fancy clothes and fast-paced lives. But Henry had learned to accept it. He was used to the judgmental stares, the whispers behind his back. People often assumed that he didn't have much to offer, that his work was beneath them. And maybe it was. But for Henry, it wasn't about what people thought of him. It was about what he could do with the life he had. And he had always done his best. As Henry moved through the diner, preparing for another day of cleaning, the sounds of clinking silverware and the low murmur of voices seemed almost comforting. There was a rhythm to it all, a predictability that made it easier to navigate. But there was one thing that had started to change over the past few months: the manager. As Henry moved through the diner, preparing for another day of cleaning, the sounds of clinking silverware and the low murmur of voices seemed almost comforting. There was a rhythm to it all, a predictability that made it easier to navigate. But there was one thing that had started to change over the past few months: the manager. Derek Adams had only recently been promoted to manager of the diner, and from the very beginning, he made it clear that he was going to run things his way. Tall, with a chiseled jawline and the polished demeanor of someone who had just stepped out of a business meeting, Derek was the kind of person who didn't mind being the center of attention. He thrived on it, in fact. His sleek suit and flashy watch made it obvious that he was more accustomed to managing corporate offices than small diners, and his presence often brought an air of arrogance to the place. Henry had noticed it immediately: Derek's attitude toward the other staff, his condescending tone when speaking to the waitresses, and his general sense of superiority. He wasn't rude, Not exactly, but there was an undeniable tension whenever he walked into the room. And Henry had learned to keep his distance, observing from the sidelines as Derek barked orders, pushing everyone around him to meet his expectations. The staff, for the most part, kept their heads down. The staff, for the most part, kept their heads down. They didn't want to risk their jobs. But Henry could see it, the way Derek treated them, like they were beneath him. And while it didn't bother Henry as much as it seemed to bother others, something about Derek's behavior always seemed to weigh heavily on him. It wasn't just the way he treated the waitstaff. It was the way he spoke to Henry, too. Henry never said anything about it. He wasn't one to confront people, not directly. He had learned long ago that it was better to keep his opinions to himself. But there were moments, small moments, when Derek's comments, offhanded remarks about Henry's lowly job, seemed to hit harder than they should. The subtle mockery, the offhand jabs at Henry's age, and of course, the way he treated him like a ghost, like someone unworthy of respect. But Henry never reacted. He just went about his work, as he always had. Still, there was an unspoken tension in the air, and Henry knew it was only a matter of time before something had to give. It was late one Tuesday morning when the tension between Henry and Derek came to a head. The diner was nearly full, the steady clink of forks on plates and the murmur of chatter filling the air. It was a typical day, until it wasn't. The customers, oblivious to the brewing storm between the two men, continued with their meals, unaware of the impending collision. Henry was sweeping the floor by the counter, his old broom moving in steady, rhythmic strokes. His back ached from hours of cleaning, but that was nothing new. What was different that day, though, was Derek's tone. Henry could feel it from across the room, the way Derek's eyes narrowed as he spoke to one of the waitresses. The words were muffled at first, but Henry didn't need to hear them clearly to know what was being said. He had been around long enough to pick up on the subtleties of Derek's attitude, the dismissiveness, the little put-downs veiled as jokes. Derek had always treated Henry like he was invisible, or worse, like he was inferior. But that day, something shifted. Maybe it was the stress of the morning rush, or maybe it was something else entirely. But Derek's words were sharper, more cutting. Henry's movements faltered for a moment, his broom stilling as he listened. He knew Derek's comments weren't directed at him, but the sting of them hit him harder than usual. "You see, Mary," Derek said, his voice carrying over the counter, "we can't keep letting people like Henry do things. I mean, I don't want to be rude, but it's just not the kind of thing you expect from someone who's, well, you know, his age." Mary, the young waitress, nodded nervously, her eyes avoiding Derek's gaze. Henry stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. His age, those two words hung in the air like an accusation. He had heard them before, many times. It wasn't just about the job. Henry knew the unspoken truth. Derek didn't think people like him, old, black, working class, deserved respect. To Derek, Henry was just another cog in the machine, a tool to be used and discarded when no longer needed. Henry's fingers tightened around the broom's handle. He had heard it all before, but something about the way Derek said it now made it feel more personal. As he resumed sweeping, his movements became mechanical, almost robotic. He focused on the dust and dirt, his eyes cast downward as he tried to ignore the heat rising in his chest. But the moment didn't pass quietly. Henry, are you done with the restroom yet? Derek's voice rang out from across the room, cutting through the noise. It was a sharp command, not a question. Derek's gaze met Henry's, a smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. Henry didn't respond right away. He knew what Derek was doing, using his authority to demean him in front of the staff. But Henry had been working at the diner for years, longer than Derek had been around. He wasn't about to let this man dictate how he felt about himself. Slowly, he stood up straighter, his back stiffening as he looked at Derek. "I'll be done when I'm done, Derek," Henry said quietly, his voice calm but firm. Derek's smirk faltered, and the air between them thickened. The tension was palpable, and the other employees in the diner, who had been watching from the sidelines, exchanged uneasy glances. Henry turned and walked toward the restroom without another word. The restroom was small and cramped, with yellowing tiles and a flickering fluorescent light. The smell of bleach mixed with the faint odor of cleaning supplies, a scent that had long since become familiar to Henry. He set down the broom and began wiping down the counters, each swipe of the cloth bringing a brief moment of peace. It was the only space in the diner where he could be alone, where he could escape from the eyes of the world for just a little while. But as Henry worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He could still hear Derek's voice in his head, mocking him, belittling him. The sting of those words lingered, even in the quiet of the restroom. Henry had dealt with this kind of treatment his entire life, being judged for the color of his skin, being treated as less than because of his age or his position in life. He paused for a moment, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The bathroom was quiet now, but Henry's mind was racing. Should he confront Derek? Should he let it slide like he had done so many times before? The thought of standing up to Derek made his stomach twist in knots. But Henry wasn't a young man anymore. He had lived through enough to know that standing by quietly wasn't always the best choice. But confrontation had never been his style. He took a deep breath and turned back to the mirror. He was about to start cleaning the sink when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Derek. The door to the restroom swung open, and Derek stepped inside, his gaze cold and calculated. Henry didn't flinch. He continued wiping the sink, his movements slow and deliberate. Derek's eyes swept over Henry, sizing him up as if he were some problem to be solved. "You know, Henry," Derek began, his voice oozing with condescension, "sometimes I wonder how you even manage to keep up with the job. You're not getting any younger, are you? Maybe it's time to think about retirement. A guy your age really ought to slow down." Henry's grip on the cloth tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm doing just fine, Derek," Derek chuckled, the sound harsh and hollow. "Sure you are. I'm just saying, we all have our time, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I appreciate the work you do here, but it's just not the same anymore. Not like it used to be." There it was again. The implication that Henry didn't belong, that his time had passed. The words were laced with judgment, and Henry could feel the weight of them pressed down on him, squeezing the breath from his chest. He turned to face Derek, his eyes meeting the younger man's. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Henry wasn't sure what had gotten into him, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to back down. "Maybe it's you who doesn't understand, Derek," Henry said, his voice low but steady. I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. You think you can just walk in here and start running things like you own the place. I've been through a lot more than you know. And I'll tell you something, I'm not going anywhere. The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief moment there was silence. Derek's smirk faltered, his expression shifting, as though he had just realized that Henry wasn't the docile, invisible man he thought he was. Henry stood tall, the weight of his experience and dignity holding him firm. In that moment, Henry knew that this was the beginning of something bigger. It wasn't just about cleaning floors or scrubbing counters anymore. It was about standing up for himself, for the respect he deserved, not just as a worker, but as a person. The bathroom door slammed shut behind Derek, echoing in the small space. Henry stood frozen, his hand still gripping the edge of the sink, his reflection staring back at him from the dirty mirror. The sharpness of the confrontation left a buzz in his head, the weight of his own words hanging in the air. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to power, something more than the usual exhaustion from a long shift. But the moment of victory was short-lived. Henry had never been one to seek conflict, and now that it was done, he wasn't sure how to handle it. He went back to scrubbing the counter, his mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. What would Derek do next? Would he escalate? Or would he let it slide, pretending it was just another argument between two men who barely knew each other? For a few minutes, all Henry could hear was the hum of the fluorescent light above and the faint chatter of the diner outside. The calmness of the bathroom seemed out of place now, almost eerie, as though the world beyond was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, the unexpected happened. The door swung open once more, this time with a force that rattled the hinges. Henry didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps on the tile floor made his stomach tighten. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He'd already said his piece. Now, all he could do was wait and see what Derek would do. Derek's voice broke the silence, colder this time, dripping with a hint of malice. "You know, Henry," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "you've really got a lot of nerve. And it's not just about this job, is it? It's about your kind. I've seen guys like you before. Old, bitter, barely holding on to what little they have left." Henry's pulse quickened. He didn't have to look up to know where this was going. He had heard these kinds of words his whole life, but hearing them from someone who held a position of power in the diner, someone who was supposed to be a leader, made the insult sting more than usual. Derek wasn't just insulting him, he was dehumanizing him. Henry's fingers tightened on the edge of the sink. He wanted to say something, anything, to put Derek in his place, but the words wouldn't come. A part of him wanted to walk away, to leave Derek to his own bitterness, but another part, a much deeper part, refused to let this slide. Not this time. Before Henry could respond, the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't Derek, but someone else, someone who had been waiting outside. A voice, familiar and unexpected, echoed through the doorway. "Is everything all right in here?" Henry turned, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized the voice. It was Maria, the diner's owner, the one person who had always treated him with respect. She wasn't just his boss. She was the one who had hired him years ago when the diner was still small, when Henry was just looking for a steady job. She was the one who had stood up for him when the others had tried to dismiss him, and now here she was, walking into the bathroom like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. "Maria," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words came out rough, like he hadn't spoken in years. Derek, visibly caught off guard, straightened up, his posture stiff. "We're just talking, Maria," he said, his tone too calm, too practiced. "Nothing to worry about." Maria's eyes flicked from Derek to Henry, her gaze piercing, sharp as a knife. "What's going on here, Derek?" she asked, her voice low, but there was an edge to it. Henry could tell she was no longer buying the act. Derek hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. He didn't answer immediately, as if searching for the right words. It was a moment of weakness, and for a brief second, Henry could see the cracks in Derek's facade. But then, just as quickly, Derek's composure returned. "I was just saying to Henry that maybe he's getting a little too old for this job," Derek said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "We all have our time, right?" Maria didn't blink. "That's not what I heard." The tension in the bathroom was palpable. Henry watched, still gripping the sink, his thoughts spinning. There was something about this moment, something that felt off, like a puzzle that was only half put together. Derek had been dismissing him for months, treating him like a servant in his own workplace. But now, Maria was here, stepping in as his ally, as she always had. And yet the situation was somehow more complicated than it seemed. "I don't appreciate what's going on here," Maria continued, her voice now firm. "Derek, you've been here for what, 2 years? And in that time, I've seen you disrespect more people than I can count. You think just because you've got a title, you can treat people any way you want? Henry's been working here long before you showed up, and he's earned his place just like everyone else." Derek's face tightened, his jaw clenched. He didn't respond at first, but Henry could feel the shift in the air. Maria wasn't just defending him, she was standing up for something bigger, for the principle of respect and fairness. Derek had crossed a line, and now Maria was making it clear he wasn't going to get away with it. But then came the twist, something Henry never expected. "You know, Maria," Derek said, a slow smile creeping onto his face, "maybe you should think about who's actually keeping this place running. The real reason the business is still here, in this location at all, might not be what you think." Henry frowned, confused. Derek's words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of what had been said pressing down on Henry's chest. Maria raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Derek took a step back, his posture suddenly defensive. He was starting to look more like a cornered animal than the confident manager he had been just moments before. "I mean, you don't know everything about what's been happening around here, do you?" Henry's mind was racing now. What was Derek talking about? What did he mean by that comment? It felt like something was about to spill, something dark, something that could change everything Henry thought he knew about the diner, about Maria, and about Derek himself. But before Derek could elaborate, the moment was interrupted by a sharp sound from the back of the restaurant. Someone had dropped a tray of glasses, the crash ringing out through the diner like a gunshot. The distraction was enough to shake everyone out of their intense gaze. Henry, still reeling from the unexpected shift in the conversation, looked at Maria, her face unreadable. There was a tension in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Derek had said something more than just words. He had hinted at something hidden beneath the surface of the diner's everyday routine. Henry didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing. This moment wasn't over. The battle for respect and dignity was far from finished, and the stakes had just been raised. The days following that confrontation in the bathroom felt like a blur to Henry. The diner, once his sanctuary, had turned into a battleground. Derek's threat lingered in his mind like a shadow, and every step he took through the greasy floors of the diner seemed to echo with the weight of his own self-doubt. But there was something different in the air now, something that made Henry feel both terrified and, for the first time in years, hopeful. Maria had kept a close eye on the situation. She had always been the calm center of the storm, the steady presence that held the diner together. But there was something in her demeanor after that day, something hardened, more protective of the people who worked under her. She wasn't just managing a business anymore. She was defending a community, a family that had supported each other for years. And Henry, who had felt invisible for so long, was now beginning to see himself as part of something bigger. It was the morning after the confrontation when things began to shift. Derek had come in earlier than usual, his face tight with anger, but Maria was already there, waiting for him, calm and composed. Henry had tried not to eavesdrop, but the words were hard to ignore. Maria had told Derek to take a few days off, something about needing time to think, to reflect. Derek had argued, but Maria's tone had left no room for negotiation. He left the diner, storming out with an air of finality that made Henry feel a sense of relief. But it wasn't just Derek who had been affected by the events. Henry, too, had changed in ways he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, he began to notice the little things, how the sunlight streamed through the diner's dusty windows, how the hum of the coffee machine was oddly comforting, and how the regulars, the ones who had become like family, had begun to look at him differently. They weren't just customers, they were people who recognized his worth. And in that recognition, Henry found his own self-worth, a piece of his dignity he had long forgotten. It was a Wednesday when the transformation became undeniable. Henry was working the breakfast shift, his movements more fluid than they had ever been. He had spent the morning serving plates of eggs and bacon, his hands steady as he filled coffee cups and took orders. The usual noise of the diner, the clinking of silverware, the chatter of customers, felt like music now. He had a rhythm, a sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. At the counter, Maria sat with her coffee, watching him from across the room. She didn't say anything, but the way she looked at him told him everything he needed to know. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to find the strength he hadn't even known he had. "You're looking good, Henry," one of the regulars, Joe, said as Henry passed by with a pot of coffee. "You've got your groove back." Henry smiled, a small but genuine curve of his lips. "Thanks, Joe. I'm getting there." But it wasn't just the regulars who were noticing. The new waitress, Lisa, who had only been working at the diner for a few weeks, was beginning to look at Henry differently too. There was a quiet admiration in her eyes, a recognition of the strength she had sensed in him, but hadn't known how to articulate. She had seen Henry work for months, serving with a quiet kind of humility, but now there was a fire in him, a spark that lit up even the darkest corners of the diner. "Hey, Henry," Lisa called to him as he wiped down a table. "Can I ask you something?" He turned to her, wiping his hands on the rag. "Of course. What's up?" "Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit? I've been meaning to ask you about something. Something important." Henry raised an eyebrow, but his curiosity got the best of him. "Sure, take a seat. What's on your mind?" She slid into the booth across from him, her posture nervous, yet determined. "I've been here a few weeks, right? And well, I've been noticing something about you. The way you work, the way you handle things. There's this quiet strength about you, Henry, and I think you're holding back, like you're afraid to step up." Henry blinked, a little taken aback by the boldness of her words. "What do you mean?" "I've heard the other guys talk," Lisa continued. "I know they don't always treat you right, but I also know you're better than that. You've got something that they don't. You don't have to be invisible anymore, you know." Her words hit Henry harder than he expected. He had been trying to stay out of the spotlight, trying to keep his head down and avoid confrontation, but Lisa was right. He had been holding back, afraid of what would happen if he stepped up, afraid of being noticed in a world where invisibility felt safer. But now, her words were breaking down the walls he had carefully built around himself. Before he could respond, Maria appeared at his side, her voice steady, but filled with purpose. "Lisa's right, Henry. You've been holding back for too long. It's time to stop hiding in the shadows. You've got a place here, and it's time you start owning it." It was a moment of clarity for Henry, a sudden realization that he didn't have to remain the quiet, invisible man he had once been. He could be more. He could rise above the whispers of doubt that had plagued him for so long. And he didn't have to do it alone. The diner, this small corner of the world, had become his family. And with their support, Henry could finally step into the light. That evening, after the dinner rush, Maria pulled him aside. "I'm proud of you, Henry. You've earned this. You've earned the respect of everyone in here. But I need to ask you something. Are you ready to take on more responsibility? Because I'm thinking it might be time for you to move up." The question was simple, but the weight of it nearly crushed Henry. He had been offered promotions before, but he had always turned them down, too afraid to risk what little stability he had. But now, the idea of taking on more responsibility felt different. It felt right. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He was ready. "I'm ready, Maria," Henry said, his voice steady, his confidence growing. "I've been ready." The next day, Henry took over as the new lead server. It wasn't a grand title, but it meant something. It meant that he had earned his place. He no longer needed to hide in the background or shrink into the corners. The transformation was complete. And in that moment, Henry knew that the diner wasn't just a place of work. It was where he had found himself again. His redemption wasn't in a single moment of triumph. It was in the steady growth that came from accepting his worth, from standing tall in the face of adversity, and from the support of a community that believed in him even when he hadn't believed in himself. It was a quiet victory, but it was his. The moral of Henry's journey was simple but profound. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against others, but against ourselves. And redemption comes not from external victories, but from finding the strength to embrace who we truly are. no matter how long it takes to get there. As Henry continued his journey of personal transformation, the diner became more than just a place of work. It became a microcosm of a community built on shared values, mutual respect, and human connection. Each day, as he served plates of food and refilled coffee cups, he began to understand the deeper significance of the relationships around him. The people who had once seemed like mere customers now felt like a second family. And within this small, unassuming space, Henry found that community wasn't just a word, it was the very foundation of his survival. In the weeks that followed his decision to take on more responsibility, Henry began to notice how much the diner was a part of the larger fabric of the neighborhood. The familiar faces that came in every morning weren't just regulars, they were the heartbeat of the place. People like Joe, the old man who sat at the same corner booth every day, and Emma, the young mother who came in after dropping her kids off at school, weren't just seeking a cup of coffee. They were seeking connection. They were seeking the comfort of being seen, heard, and acknowledged in a world that often felt too fast and too disconnected. Maria, the diner's owner, had always known this. She had spent years cultivating a sense of belonging for everyone who entered. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a nurturer, a listener, and a connector. Her ability to create an atmosphere where people could share their joys, their frustrations, and their life stories was what made the diner special. It was the place where people didn't just come to eat. They came to be reminded that they mattered. For Henry, this realization was powerful. He had spent most of his life feeling like an outsider, invisible to the world around him. But in the diner, he began to understand that true community isn't built on grand gestures or superficial connections. It's built on everyday moments of care and attention. It's in the smile of a stranger who greets you every morning, the conversation shared over a cup of coffee, and the unspoken understanding between people who, despite their differences, share the same space and experiences. One evening, after the last customers had left, Maria asked Henry to stay behind. She had a request, a simple but meaningful one. "Henry," she said, her voice steady, "I've been thinking about the future of this place. I want you to help me with something important. It's time we gave back to the community that has supported us for so long." Henry was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Maria smiled. "I want to host a charity event, a community dinner, where we invite everyone in the neighborhood to come and share a meal. We'll provide food for free, and we'll ask people to bring what they can, whether it's a donation, a volunteer effort, or just their presence. It's time to give back. We're more than just a diner. We're part of something bigger." The idea was simple, yet profound. Maria wasn't just asking for a charity event. She was asking for the community to come together in the most basic and human of ways, over food, conversation, and shared experiences. Henry didn't hesitate. He knew this was the next step, the natural evolution of what had already begun within the walls of the diner. He had seen firsthand how people's lives had been touched by the connections they had made here. It was time for those bonds to stretch beyond the confines of the diner and extend into the neighborhood. In the weeks leading up to the event, the diner buzzed with excitement. The regulars pitched in, offering their help in every way imaginable. Joe, who had been coming to the diner for years, volunteered to set up tables and chairs. Emma, the young mother, organized the kids' activities. Even Derek, The troubled regular who had caused so much tension in the past offered to help in any way he could. It was as if the event itself had reignited something in all of them. A reminder that, despite their differences, they were all part of the same story. The night of the event, the diner was transformed. The small, humble space was filled with tables covered in white cloths, fairy lights hanging from the ceiling, and a sense of warmth that was palpable. People from all walks of life filled the seats. Families, retirees, teenagers, and even people who had never set foot in the diner before. It wasn't just a dinner. It was a celebration of community, of human connection. As the evening unfolded, Henry couldn't help but marvel at the sheer power of what was happening. People who had once been strangers were now talking, laughing, and sharing stories. The lines between regulars and newcomers blurred, and what emerged was something greater than the sum of its parts, a genuine sense of belonging. It wasn't about who had the most money or the most status. It was about who was willing to show up and be a part of something meaningful. In one corner of the room, Joe was telling stories of his youth, while a group of teenagers listened intently, fascinated by the tales of days gone by. Emma was seated at a table with her children, chatting with a young couple who had just moved into the neighborhood. And, in the back, Henry noticed Derek, standing awkwardly at first, but gradually being pulled into conversations by others. It was a small miracle, the way people came together, the way the diner had become a bridge between individuals who might never have crossed paths in any other setting. Maria stood by the entrance, watching it all unfold with a quiet smile. Henry approached her, his eyes wide with awe. "This is amazing. I didn't realize how much this could mean." Maria nodded, her gaze sweeping across the room. "It's about connection, Henry. It's about making people feel like they matter. We've built something here, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who walks through that door." And as Henry stood there, taking in the scene before him, he realized that Maria was right. The power of community wasn't in the grand gestures or the big events. It was in the small, everyday acts of kindness and support. It was in the way people lifted each other up, even when life felt hard. And most importantly, it was in the way a place like the diner could bring people together and make them feel like they belonged. As the night came to a close, Henry looked around one last time, his heart full. This wasn't just a diner. This was a sanctuary, a place where people didn't just come to eat. They came to be seen, to be heard, and to be part of something bigger than themselves. And in that moment, Henry understood the true meaning of community. It wasn't just about shared spaces. It was about shared humanity. It was about the way people, when given the chance, could come together to support and lift each other up, creating something lasting and beautiful in the process. The night ended with a sense of unity and hope that lingered long after the last plate had been cleared. The diner, now more than ever, had become a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose to connect with one another, when they chose to embrace the power of community and humanity. And for Henry, it was the final piece in his journey of transformation. The lesson was clear. When we come together, we are capable of creating change, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. The night of the community dinner had been nothing short of magical. Henry had seen the transformation in everyone, From Derek, the troubled regular who had once been the diner's most difficult customer, to the young mother, Emma, whose shy smile now radiated with a new confidence. For Henry, it was a moment of realization that change, no matter how small, could have rippling effects in ways no one could predict. But as the evening drew to a close, the emotional weight of the event reached a crescendo that neither Henry nor anyone else could have anticipated. The crowd had begun to thin. People lingered, some cleaning up, others in deep conversation, but the energy had softened into a sense of quiet contentment. It was then that Maria, looking exhausted but content, pulled Henry aside. Her eyes were tired, but filled with something more, something Henry hadn't seen before. It was the same quiet determination he had come to admire in her over the months, but now it was tinged with a kind of urgency. "Henry," she said softly, "I need to talk to you about something." Henry nodded, his heart pounding with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. "What's wrong, Maria?" Maria didn't respond immediately. She turned to look at the small crowd in the diner, her gaze sweeping over the people she had served for so many years. Then her eyes met Henry's once more, and there was an unmistakable sadness in her expression. "It's about the diner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's stomach dropped. He had known the diner wasn't doing well financially, but this was more than just a slow day or a few bad months. Something deeper was happening, and Henry could sense it. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tense with worry. Maria took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "The truth is, I've been struggling to keep it afloat. The bills are piling up, and we've barely been breaking even for months. I didn't want to burden anyone with it, but—" She trailed off, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. Henry felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He had grown so attached to the diner, to the people, and to the sense of purpose it had given him. The thought of losing it was unbearable. "Maria, we can't let this place go," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "This diner means so much to everyone. We've built something here. You've built something." "I know," Maria replied, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "But I can't keep it going alone. I've tried everything, Henry. I don't know what else to do." A silence hung between them, both of them aware of the gravity of the situation. Henry's mind raced as he thought about the community that had come together that night, the bonds that had been forged, and the people who had found solace in the diner's warm embrace. How could he just let it all slip away? And then a thought hit him. It was the very thing Maria had taught him over the past months. This wasn't just about one person, one diner. This was about a community, about people coming together to support each other. If they could raise each other up in small ways, maybe they could do the same for the diner. "I won't let you do this alone," Henry said, his voice steady now, his resolve clear. "I'll help. We'll help. This place has always been more than just a business. It's part of who we are, all of us." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and Henry could see the relief in them, but she shook her head, a small defeated laugh escaping her lips. "It's too late, Henry. There's nothing more we can do." But Henry wasn't ready to give up. Not now, not after everything they had built together. The thought of walking away, of letting the diner slip into history as just another failed business, was too much to bear. Instead, he took a deep breath and made a decision. "We'll fight for it," Henry said. the words sounding like a promise. We'll talk to everyone who came tonight. I know they care about this place. They'll help. Together, we can save it. Maria looked at him, uncertainty still clouding her face. But she didn't argue. Henry could see the spark of hope rekindling in her eyes. You really think so? I know so, Henry replied, his voice firm. We've come this far because of the connections we've made, because of the community we've built. That's the most valuable thing we have. If we lean on that, we can turn this around. And so, that night, after the last of the guests had left, Henry and Maria began to plan. They reached out to the people who had shown up for the dinner, the ones who had supported them without hesitation. They explained the situation, asking for donations, help with repairs, and offers of labor. They didn't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but they knew that if the community cared enough to come together for a meal, they would care enough to save the diner. The response was overwhelming. Joe, the elderly regular who had been coming for years, offered to pay for a month's worth of bills to help keep the diner afloat. Emma, the young mother, rallied the local mothers group to donate what they could, whether it was money, time, or supplies. Even Derek, who had once been one of the diner's biggest troublemakers, offered to help with the renovation of the kitchen, using his construction skills to pitch in. Over the following weeks, the diner began to change. There were repairs made to the building, new coats of paint, and a renewed energy that filled the air. Henry, once a man who had only seen the world through the lens of his own struggles, had now found his place in something much bigger than himself. He had become a catalyst for change, not just for the diner, but for the community that had supported him all along. And on the day that the repairs were complete, Maria stood in the doorway, looking at the fresh, vibrant space that had been given new life. Henry stood beside her, his heart full as he saw the fruits of their collective labor. "This is it," Maria said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We did it, Henry. We saved it." Henry smiled, feeling the weight of the journey lift from his shoulders. "No, Maria, we didn't save it. We brought it back to life. And that's something we did together." In that moment, as the doors opened and the familiar faces began to filter in once again, Henry knew that the true value of the diner wasn't in the food or the building. It was in the people, the community, that had risen up to save it. It was a place of connection, of love, of resilience. And in that emotional climax, Henry understood that the most important thing of all was not the survival of the diner, but the survival of the bonds that held them all together. As the last of the renovations were completed, the diner stood as a testament to the power of community and resilience. The familiar neon sign outside buzzed softly in the evening air, its warm glow spilling onto the street like a beacon of hope. Inside, the atmosphere was filled with the clinking of coffee cups and the hum of quiet conversations, sounds that, only a few months ago, had seemed distant and impossible. Maria and Henry stood side by side at the counter, watching as the first group of customers filtered in for the evening rush. They exchanged a look, both knowing that they had been through something truly remarkable. What had started as a struggling business had transformed into a thriving, vibrant gathering place, a symbol of everything they had fought for and everything they had gained. "I never thought this would happen," Maria said, her voice full of quiet wonder. She wiped a stray tear from her eye, but this time it wasn't one of sadness. It was a tear of relief and gratitude. "We did it, Henry. You helped me believe in this place again." Henry smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "No, Maria, you did this. You've been the heart and soul of this diner all along. I just helped bring it back to life." Maria chuckled softly, shaking her head. "You brought the community together. You gave us the strength to keep going. We wouldn't have made it without you." It was true. Henry had arrived in town a stranger, carrying the weight of his own past. He had come to this diner in search of something. Purpose, perhaps. Or maybe just a place to belong. What he had found, though, was so much more than that. He had found a family in a group of people who had once felt like strangers to him. Together, they had weathered the storm of uncertainty and come out stronger on the other side. As the evening wore on, the diner continued to bustle with activity. Derek, the once volatile regular, who had been one of the first to offer his help, was now sitting at the counter, chatting with a young couple about their recent engagement. Emma, the shy mother, who had found a new sense of confidence through the dinner, was working alongside Maria, laughing as they refilled coffee cups and wiped down the counters. Henry looked around the room, taking in the scene. He realized that this wasn't just about saving a business. It was about saving relationships, about rebuilding trust, and about giving people a second chance. The moment that truly defined the diner's transformation came when Joe, the elderly regular who had always been there to offer a kind word or a joke, walked up to the counter. He looked at Henry with a twinkle in his eye, his weathered face lit up with a warmth that Henry had come to associate with his presence. "You know," Joe said with a chuckle, "I've been coming here for years, and I've never seen the place looking like this. I think you've got a gift, kid." Henry laughed softly, shaking his head. "It's not me, Joe. It's all of us." Everyone chipped in. Joe nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "Well, it's more than just the repairs, Henry. It's the way you brought people together. You gave us all a reason to believe again. We've been through a lot, but tonight I feel like there's hope again." Henry swallowed, his emotions rising to the surface. The diner had been his refuge, but now it had become something far more important. It was a place where people found solace, where they shared their stories, and where, together, they began to heal. Maria appeared at his side, her smile as bright as ever. "You know," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride, "we couldn't have done this without each other. We've all got our scars, but we've learned to lean on one another. And that's what saved us." Henry nodded, feeling the weight of those words sink in. "Yeah, we've all been through our own battles, but together we've come out stronger." As the night wound down and the last customers made their way out the door, Henry and Maria lingered for a few extra moments. They stood at the counter, watching as the lights outside flickered softly. The diner had been saved, but more importantly, it had been transformed into something far greater. It had become a symbol of the power of forgiveness, redemption, and the strength of community. The next day, Henry received a letter in the mail, a simple envelope with no return address. Inside, he found a handwritten note from Derek. It read, "Henry, I've been through a lot in my life. I've made mistakes and I've hurt people, but I've learned that it's never too late to turn things around. I just want to say thank you for believing in me, for believing in all of us. This diner isn't just a place to eat. It's a place where we all got a second chance. I won't forget that." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes as he read the words. In that moment, he realized that the diner wasn't just a physical place. It was a metaphor for the lives of everyone who had come together to save it. Each person had been given a second chance, a new opportunity to rebuild, to heal, and to grow. As Henry folded the letter and placed it in his pocket, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The diner would continue to thrive, but more than that, the connections they had forged would endure. No matter the challenges that lay ahead, Henry knew that they were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was all they really needed. As the sun rose the next morning, casting a golden glow over the diner, Henry stood outside, breathing in the fresh air. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace, knowing that the best was yet to come. The diner was just the beginning. The real journey was only just starting. It was a journey of hope, of healing, and of community. And together, they would face whatever came next. What do you think? Could the power of community and second chances really transform a place, a life, or even a person? If you were in Henry's shoes, would you have been able to forgive, rebuild, and unite such a fractured group? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales of redemption, transformation, and the incredible power of human connection. Together, we can all make a difference, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.